So what I've got here is some pine to do the actual bending for this project. I looked into some fairly straight grain quarter sawn pine at my local store, and I went ahead and ripped it down. It started out as a 1 by 12 by 8 foot pine board. I ripped off the section that I could use and got about a 5.5 inch board. Cleaned it up a little bit so you can see we are at final dimension of just about 5 1/4 on these, and I have two different sizes that I was able to get. My first one's at 28 inches, and my second one is at 34 inches. It's some really nice stuff all in all. As you can see, the grain on it is nice and straight. Probably can't see it from this direction, but it's a quarter sawn. And hopefully it's going to bend pretty well. Started out at 1 inch. I was able to run it through my table saw to resaw it down to nominal 8-inch thick, and then after that sanded it smooth and flat to get it down so it's slightly under 8 inches now. Next step is going to be actually to get it in the water and get it heating to bend. So once the wood is nice and hot, next step is going to be to wrap it around a form. My research shows that a couple of different options are available. The most common seems to be to use an actual form to wrap the lath around to get the shape. There have been suggestions that perhaps it was actually placed inside of a hollowed form instead and allowed to expand out, or if it was soft enough, just bent and clamped by hand. But more research, more evidence seems to show that it was actually done around a form. So in this case, I've got a small round form. It takes a lath, when I measured it, of about a 28 by 4. So my smaller laths are actually going to go around this one when they come out. The size of this one is actually taken off of one of the Coppergate finds from one of the books that I've got in my bibliography. The process that I'm going to go ahead and use on this is I use a bunch of spring clamps. They're modern, but they work really well. I'm still working on research on how to use what period would be used for this particular style. So what I will end up doing is once these come out of the water is I will line it up. We'll come over here and I'll just grab some little cauls, little scraps of plywood that I've got. And then these, you can see, have recessed holes that are in here, and I will go through and I will clamp them top and bottom to the form, and then I will use the flatness of the table, and as I go I will roll it up around the form, clamping as I go to get a nice tight fit around until it closes. Once that's done, it'll just get to the side and dry. After a few days, I'll end up with a form that comes off somewhat oval. They tend to be a little bit off the round due to that overlap there. And then from there, once it's fully dried, another couple of days, it'll get glued up and be ready to move on to the next step. So on the subject of forms, there are a couple of different shapes that have been found. Some of them can come out and you see them in depictions on manuscripts and up on illuminated images. You'll find them on shelves, you'll find them on under benches, things like that. Tend to have kind of a rounded square shape. It's not really an oval, it's not really a round. They tend to seem to have very flat sides and flat edges, but just the corners have been knocked off. And those seem to be the most common in manuscripts. As far as archaeological finds, a number of them that have been found are actually round, pretty darn close to it, which is more what this one here is. In my case, I've got a bit of a shelf put on here just as kind of a stop for the edge of the lath to go, and then I'll clamp it around. There have also been some found attributed to earlier. They're not quite as common, which is a true oval type shape. And they're a little bit easier to bend in some respects since they don't have that dual flat area in there, but they don't seem to be quite as common that I can document as actually usably within period. They seem to be more common post-period for more especially Scandinavian countries. Now I've talked about clamps and I've shown the use of the modern spring clamps and cauls. Both useful for when they go on the form, but also when they come off the form and when they're gluing together. It works really well to put a couple on there and then just clamp it down to keep it all tightly in place while the glue dries. One of the fascinating little bits I found as far as use of possible clamps is in a book called Woodworking in Estonia, and they actually use a split log or a split branch clamp, which is really no more than just a couple of split pieces of wood flat on the side, and then they are usually twine or cord of some sort to secure one end, and then that'll go on very similar to the clamps and cawls. One end's already closed, so the other end gets pinched closed, much like an old style wooden clothespin. And it'll just come up, and then the end gets lashed closed to hold it in place and lock it that way. That's also been suggested and used especially in pure green bending, when they're bending really long pieces to make large oval sieves and for grain and things like that, that they're just cut from the tree, they're split and then bent with hand with no heat whatsoever, and then clamped shut like that and allowed to dry for a few days. Very much post-period, but it's a possible option that I've explored as well. I have done some by hand this way, and they actually turned out pretty decently. Okay, so this is my actual setup for heating. This is a hot water tank that I have cut in half. It works really well. It's got the ceramic lining inside it, so it keeps it from rusting too bad and also reacting with any of the wood that I have in here. Things like oak, the tannins in oak, when I bend that, would react with a plain metal and stain everything black, which is kind of interesting, but not what I want all the time. So this is a household hot water heater tank. It's set on top of a 3-burner camp stove powered by propane, and I've got about 3 inches of water in here. So I've got 6 slats in here that I'm going to toss in the wood, 5 of them for bending around to form, and then the 6 will be done as just a freehand form. And then I've got a bunch of just chunks of scrap aluminum that I use to weigh down the slats while they're in the water, to keep them completely submerged so they get equal heat all around as much as possible. If I don't, they tend to float on top, and then I've got one surface of the wood that is just exposed to the air, so it's not getting the heat, and I'm not getting a consistent temperature throughout the wood. These will go in here. They will stay temperature. Usually I go really unscientific, but if it gets to the point that I can just dip my hand in there and it's really uncomfortable, usually they'll go, and it takes about 10 minutes. So I'll go ahead and get these in the water, and I will start heating them up, and then we'll bend them. So here is the water in the trough. I've got the heat going underneath it to get things started. As they've gone in, I put each one in individually, got it thoroughly wet, and then separated them a bit so that they're not all together in a mass. Helps to spread them out and get a little bit more even cooking on them to get them up to temperature. I have a thermometer in the water. I normally go by feel and by testing to see when the boards get to a point. I've done it enough that I kind of know where that magic spot is, but actually measuring it so that people can get an idea of how hot their water needs to be if they try to reproduce this result is kind of a next step to pass on. When these are ready, I will then pick them up, carefully pull them out of the water and move over to my bench and start clamping and bending as I go. They are really thin, so they lose heat really quick, and as they cool down, the risk of cracking goes up greatly. So this is a very time-sensitive step once they're ready to go. Usually it takes about 10 to 12 minutes to heat them up to temperature and get them ready to bend. This one came out of the water with the temperature reading 185 degrees. It's a little stiffer than I might like, but we're going to see if we can get it to work. So far so good, no cracks or pops. One thing I have not experienced before, because I don't use pine a whole lot, is that the hot water has definitely released all of that resin into the water, making the water really sticky, which is kind of also pretty gross. pop the first ones off, being careful to put even pressure on it as I go so that it doesn't bend and tear out the end of the board, which I have had problems with in the past. All right. Okay, that one turned out pretty well. I've got a bit of tear out at the bottom here. You probably can't see it from here, but if you look real closely right here, there was a spot of sap in there between the layers. Probably some damage to the tree at some point in the bark layer that is starting to come crack loose. But with that, it's a pretty minor, 1/4 of an inch or so. I can slice that off after it's dried and go from there. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Okay, we're doing another small round one here. Again, this one has that same problem. It's got that bit of sap stuck right on the bottom edge, so I might have that blowout as well. But not much I can do about that, except hope for the best. These are bending really nicely. I am really happy with this. These are a bit thicker than some I've done in the past, so I was a little curious how well they would work in that respect, but it's actually going really well. The fact that the pine is so soft is definitely a factor in this, but I'm sticking to everything from the resin, which is really an unusual feeling. Okay, 2 down, so far so good. Now I don't know if you can see this in here, it's a kind of a tight little mess, but there is definitely a spot, you can kind of see right here, where this is an even cylinder and it's an even thickness, but just little bits of distortion keep it from lining up, so now my ends are a little bit skewed. You can see this back portion here is a little higher. I can fix that once I get to the gluing stage. It just means I got to be really careful with it to glue it up straight so that the walls are square and I don't end up with a cone. This one's a little bit larger, as you can see, so presents a few complications. This is longer sweeps, not quite as sharp of a bend on the sides, but this end bend can really be tricky because it's a much sharper radius. I can hear the very faintest of creaking from it as I'm rolling. But it's looking pretty good. these are a little bit different. Instead of drilling the holes in them, I actually took the time and routed out the top so that it's just a rim around the end as opposed to individual holes. So it makes finding clamping points a lot easier. One of these days I intend to go back and kind of retrofit all of my forms that way, just because I get so much less of a headache doing it. And again, this one you'll be able to see that bit of a unequal pressure on there so that my sides are not completely square. So I've got a good bit of it's out of alignment a good bit. You can see right, where'd it go? Right there, how much it's sticking out. One of the other things, the water raises the grain, making it actually more prone to tear out as well. So it's definitely a matter of fighting a lot of different forces when you're doing this. Okay, so here we're going to try this one and just bending it freeform. You can see these are bending pretty darn beautifully on their own. The nice thing about doing this is it's much quicker. So I'm not racing against the clock quite as much to try and get it to the form, because it's going to form oh, that's not good. It's going to form itself. Well, we're going to have to just split it here. Let's see if that'll actually work. These cords need to be replaced. I were an experiment with what I had on time at the moment, and apparently that moment is past and it's time to do something else. Okay, now you can see this one has got a very definite point on one end, so I'm going to kind of play with it a little bit and see if I can get it a little more round. Ooh. There was a little bit of a crack there. Okay, not the greatest. You can see I've got a pretty sharp bend on this point, a nice round one over here. It's hard to tell. I could have put a little less pressure on the one side, a little more on the other. Could be that it was slightly thinner on that side, or a little bit of weakness in the wood. But again, it's really similar to some of these oval shapes here, which kind of indicates that pretty good chance that these are actually more likely the earlier period shapes. In some cases was done without the form, whereas the more regular and smooth-sided ones were with the form. Alright. This one is really, really sticky. As we're moving along and everything's still sitting in the water, distilling it and making pine syrup. Tiny little cricks and cracks, but nothing major. Okay. This has been a really good day for bending so far. Which, of course, Murphy's Law being what it is, means the next one's going to blow up in my face. these don't have quite the same amount of overlap that the other ones do. This form is actually a little bit bigger than the rounds. So it's still going to be completely usable. It's just not as pronounced. It's usually about it's a 3-inch, maybe 4-inch overlap. And this one's close to about 1.5 inches. But you got that nice round end. I'm liking that. Turned out pretty good. Last one. By using the tabletop as I am, I'm actually using it as kind of a backstrap to it that actually helps prevent breakout in a lot of cases. The fiber of the wood is sandwiched between the form and the table, so it doesn't have anywhere to go. It can't explode outwards so easily. When I first started doing the bent wood, I was actually using a thin metal strap piece of flashing that goes on around your chimney and the roof to do the same thing. I've kind of moved away from it, partly out of hubris. Hell, I'm good enough, I don't need to do it. But mainly because I was finding that as long as I got my wood to a good temperature and the moisture consistency was good, it wasn't needed as much. Especially when I'm rolling it on the table like this, it does the job just as well. When I first started doing this, I had about 25% success rate. Whereas this nice batch today here came out with, I'd say, about a 90% success rate. They all bent well, none of them exploded. I'll be able to use all of them. They're not as nice as I would like. The first couple of them had a little bit of tear out. And we're going to have to see, because as it dries and the wood shrinks a bit, I might get some more. Sometimes I'll get some grain tear out on the surface, but again, that's not much I can do at this point other than just wait and see. So now that we've bent these, they are going to sit overnight, give them a chance to dry out a little bit and the form to set. They're already pretty cool to the touch at this point. That moisture in there helps to bend, but it also transmits the heat both in and out. So now that they're in the air, they're drying pretty cool. The next step is going to go from here to here. This was my entry into Kingdom A&S single entry a couple of years ago. This is an ash shell with a beech bottom, and this one is actually bent just like I bent this one here. It was bent by hand with no form around it. You can see it's got kind of a slightly triangular shape to it and rounded. The bottom is not actually attached in this one. I didn't get to do that, but they're normally pegged in there. This one does not have any glue to hold it together. It is purely laced shut. This is an older style that I was looking when I was still trying to research to figure out how to lace them shut. So my next step to go from this to this is, once these will dry, I will pull them out, I will glue up the overlap, and then clamp that again for about 24 hours. Once that's done, I will use the finished form to trace out a base and then cut and fit the bottom into it. Also in here, I need to figure out a closure for them, a top. So whether or not I go for a snap lid similar to this one, where they pull apart and close, which is only really documentable the post period, but is really handy. Or if I go similar to this one here, which in progress again, but actually has a ring on it, so it'll have a fitted lid and it just closes kind of like a modern piece of Tupperware. It just slides down on there. Will depend on box by box. But The lacing process, I've gone from this and using a synthetic modern material, it's actually paper, to I've actually researched a bit more, and now I'm using pieces of the inner bark from a cedar tree. It's a nice flexible fiber. It goes in and out pretty well, and it actually wraps around in there and closes more in keeping with not only some of the means of the time, but also it produces a look that looks exactly like what I'm seeing on manuscripts. So we had a pretty good day. We got 6 boxes bent. 5 of them are bent around forms. 1 of them is bent free form, and it looks like all will end up being usable. I'll have to watch for tear out and for distortion when it goes. Once I actually go to the next step, which is going to be to do glue up, I will worry about making sure everything is square and that they are the same top to bottom. But I'm pretty happy with it. It was a good day.